Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, can we start? It's a pleasure to see all of you here. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Dapo Akande. I'm Professor of Public International Law here at the Blavatnik School of Government. And it's wonderful to be hosting this event as the first event that the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict is hosting this academic year. The Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, ELAC for short, is a multidisciplinary program which is now based at the Blavatnik School of Government, and I might say a little bit more about the program at the end. It's our honor to be hosting this launch of the book by Professor Harold Koh, The Trump Administration and International Law. I'm just going to get the book. There we are. There we are. So this is hot off the press from Oxford University Press. And apparently, this is, I'm told by the OUP law editors, the perfect venue to be hosting this book launch. I assume that it was because we are at the Blavatnik School of Government, and this book is about government and international law, but apparently it's just because we're across the road from Oxford University Press. The author of this book, Professor Harold Koh, who is sitting in front of you, is a phenomenal international lawyer and public servant. He has served in the US administration over many years, interspersed, I don't even know which is interspersing which. He's an academic and he's interspersed his academic career with working in government, or he's a public servant who's interspersed that with his academic work. Somehow he manages to excel in all of these issues. He has, he's clerked in the US Supreme Court. He has worked under various administrations in the US government. He's worked in the Department of Justice under the Reagan administration. He was Assistant Secretary of Human Rights and Labor under President Clinton. And most recently, he was the legal advisor to the State Department under Secretary Clinton and President Obama. As an academic, he has spent a significant number of years as a professor of international law at Yale Law School, and he was dean of Yale Law School just before he went back to the State Department to be legal advisor in the Obama administration. I don't have enough time to talk about the various honors that have been conferred on him. I think it's 17 honorary degrees or something like that. He is returning to Oxford today because he was a student here. He's honorary fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford. He's been a distinguished visiting fellow at Balliol College in Oxford, and it's a real pleasure to have him with us. Also with us today is Shaheed Fatima QC, who is also returning to Oxford. She was also a student here at the University of Oxford. She is one of the leading international lawyers and human rights lawyers in this country and around the world. Shaheed has appeared in cases in courts at all levels in the UK, including several cases in the UK Supreme Court. She is a leading advocate at the European Court of Human Rights, where she's been involved in some of the most significant cases on various issues to do with human rights, but especially issues to do with human rights and armed conflict. She has been involved as counsel in cases before the International Court of Justice, and it's a real pleasure to have Shaheed come and talk to Professor Harold Koh about his book. So the format of the event is that I will exit the stage and I will leave it to Shaheed Fatima to put some questions to Professor Koh and to have a discussion with Professor Koh about his book. For those of you who have just come in, there are a number of seats on this side and there are also one or two seats in front. So please do come and take a seat. After we've had the discussion between Shaheed and Harold, there will be question and answer time. And just to say, in case I forget at the end, there are several copies of the book at the stand at the back over there. If you book to purchase, not just to take. Several copies to purchase, I should add. If you don't have your credit card on you at this point, you can still get the discount that is on offer. So there's is it 30% discount? And it's priced at, what, $13.99 if you buy it today. But the discount is still available if you pick up a flyer and you just use that code online on the OUP website. You can still get a copy of the book.
Dapo. As Dapo's explained, I'm going to be asking Harold some questions about his book. It's attracted endorsements from an incredibly wide range of people. So Hillary Rodham Clinton has described it as an indispensable book. Madeleine Albright has described Harold quite rightly as one of the world's most brilliant legal minds, and there are a whole range of other comments there as well. Before I launch into questions, I wanted to just say a few words about Harold's personal story. Harold's parents grew up under Japanese colonial rule in what is now part of North Korea. They weren't allowed to speak Korean. They weren't even allowed to use their Korean names. And as a result of the conflict in the Korean peninsula, they would eventually seek asylum in the United States of America, where both of them became distinguished academics and were the first Asian Americans to teach at Yale. In fact, Harold's been telling me some things about his mother, which I didn't know before, including the fact that she took up calligraphy at the age of 73, which is extraordinary in itself. The Koh children grew up in America, and it's partly as a result of this personal context, I think, that Harold has such a deep understanding of freedom and such a deep understanding of human rights, and that has informed what I think anybody would regard as an extraordinary path in the law. It's a particular honor for us at Blackstone Chambers because Harold's been affiliated with us for a number of years, and so it's a real pleasure to be here to ask you questions. I want to start by asking you to explain, please, the genesis of the book, and also to summarize, if you can, the counter-strategy that I know lies at the heart of it.
So the day after the election where Donald Trump was president, we had a school meeting, and one of my students came to me with tears in his eyes, and he says, can America and the world win if Donald Trump loses? And I said, yes, because international law is a lot bigger than Donald Trump. And people ask me to expand on that, and that remains my theme. The analogy that I use is to the famous prize fight between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, in which Ali employed what was known as the rope-a-dope, where at the beginning of the fight, which Foreman was so heavily favored to win, Ali just retreated to the ropes, absorbed punishment, occasionally counterpunched and sort of taunted his opponent. Now, at the seventh round of that fight, if you were observing it, you would have said, who's winning? And most people would have said, Foreman's winning. In fact, Muhammad Ali knocked him out in the next round. And I think we're very close to that moment now. Now, the counter strategy that I propose is my academic theory, transnational legal process. Donald Trump acts on impulse. He has a series of sporadic ideas. They're vaguely directed toward the notions of anti-globalism, but he has very little follow-through. And as a net result of which, when you actually look at what's happening, there's a flurry of activity, but very few real victories. And so the heft of international law and transnational legal process is resisting him. The final message is really to our friends abroad. Donald Trump is not America. The America you trusted, we're still here, and we're fighting. And the message is one of resistance and resilience. There is resistance across the board to the things that are happening in the name of the values we hold dear. And these institutions are resilient, and they will bounce back and fix our country after Donald Trump is gone.
So when you talk about the counter-strategy transnational legal process in the book, you give a number of illustrations about how that's worked in practice, and one of the illustrations is immigration. So could you speak a little bit about that? Because I know you were personally involved in that particular counter-strategy.
Yeah, so, Donald Trump has a blame foreigners strategy, and it started with the Muslim ban, or as he later tried to call it, a travel ban. As Bill Clinton famously said, doesn't matter how much lipstick you put on that pig, still a Muslim ban. Now, what happened, which was quite remarkable, was that he called for extreme vetting. But what he didn't get was that extreme vetting means individualized vetting. There's a simple notion, which is that we judge people by the content of their character, not by stereotypes based on who they are. So I represented a group of people who were former national security officials. Most of them were nice enough to then give me blurbs, which said that there was no national security threat. He imposed this ban in a more ineffective way based on no threat. And we litigated this case. Now, the case was blocked 30 times in the lower courts. But what was amazing was how many people kind of joined in along the way. My own students at Yale Law School went to New York to JFK Airport. They were asked to represent a Iraqi interpreter who had worked for the U.S. forces. And they filed a class action habeas motion. And they uploaded to the web templates of these documents. And all around America, people went to airports, downloaded the same templates, put in the names of their clients. And suddenly all of the resistance that had been on the streets moved into the airports. And then the Uber and the Lyft drivers and the taxi drivers joined them. And it became a global, a nationwide effort. Now, I know what you're going to say, which is that Trump won the travel ban case in June. In fact, all he's won is stage one. He blocked a preliminary injunction. But there's still now the effort to prove that the ban is discriminatory as applied. There's also going to be litigation in Europe. So the transnational legal process goes on, and he has not prevailed.
I think you also give another example of human rights as being an illustration of the counter-strategy. And you refer to President Trump's statement as a candidate that if he was elected, and I quote, "will use waterboarding and a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding." And you talk about that in the book. So how did the counter-strategy work in the context of torture?
So my view is a very simple one. The reason most people obey the law is not because of sanction. It's because of obedience. Religion is the most powerful set of norms that people internalize.
You have a great example, actually, in the book about why we all stop for a red light in the middle of the night when nobody's around, because of that very notion.
Yeah, or why you recycle, or why you put on a seatbelt. What you started to do as a matter of prudence, you eventually do because you think it's right. Now, Trump made this bold claim, I'm going to go back to torture and waterboarding, and a lot worse than waterboarding. But he made the mistake of surrounding himself with officials, all of whom had served in the military, and all of those people are trained in the Geneva Conventions. So Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, the former National Security Advisor, McMaster, even Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, Gina Haspel, who is a controversial CIA director, all of them took a pledge that they would not violate the Geneva Conventions. So Trump has said this, and it's has the legal force of a tweet.
And so to talk about that a little bit more, when we talk about the immigration context, you're talking about transnational legal process being used to litigate by using international law and human rights norms in a way which holds the government to those standards. But in relation to the torture example, you're talking about the people who are already in the government helping to maintain those rule of law norms.
Exactly. There's an outside strategy for compliance, which is you bring suits to try to get norms internalized. The inside strategy is you turn to bureaucrats who have taken an oath to uphold the office. They have not sworn to obey Trump. if you've read the shocking book by Bob Woodward, you know, his own staff is seizing documents off his desk. I mean, they won't do the things that he wants them to do. You know, it's been rumored that one reason that Nikki Haley resigned yesterday as ambassador to the UN is she is the anonymous op-ed writer. And I heard that from somebody authoritative, but I'm not sure if it's true, but sounds good, so I'll say it. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that they describe themselves, I mean, Trump calls them deep state, and so does Steve Bannon. In fact, what they represent is people who have an oath to uphold the law, not simply to obey Trump. So the outside and the inside strategy work synergistically.
They complement each other. And in the book, after you've described this outside-inside synergy, you talk about this attitude of what you call resigning without leaving, and you discuss it in relation to a couple of issues like climate change, trade diplomacy. What does that mean? What is resigning without leaving?
Right, so Trump basically wants to satisfy his base. His base is anti-globalist. So he announced he's leaving the Paris Climate Agreement. Unfortunately, under international law, you cannot give notification to do so till November 2019. It doesn't become effective till November 2020, which is the day after the next presidential election. So right now, all he said is, I intend to do this. We're still in. So we've resigned and we haven't left. Now, as you know, when you resign from something and you don't leave, your influence drops to zero. Why should they listen to you anymore? I mean, we haven't left the Iran nuclear deal either. In the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we left, and then now we're trying to get back in. So, you know, it comes back to that famous song, you know, breaking up is hard to do. when your life is very, and you've seen it graphically with Brexit. When a domestic system becomes legally intertwined with an international organization and treaty, it's not that easy to leave. Now, Trump's view of the world is transactional, deals. He says, it's a bad deal, let's leave. In fact, life is relational, and you know, it's not so easy to leave. So the default strategy for him has actually become resigning without leaving, which means we're still in, but not influential in the future of these agreements.
So it's self-serving, fundamentally.
Self-serving, but also self-defeating, fundamentally.
Right. And how about the way in which the Trump administration has dealt with what you call countries of concern, like North Korea? How effective has his approach in that context been?
Well, obviously, because of the history that Shaheed and Dapo were kind enough to describe, you know, I've been to North Korea 3 times. I went with Albright in 2000. You know, Kim Jong-un he looks funny, but he's a very smart guy. And Trump is not so smart. And the message of it all is that Trump has completely been had by Kim Jong-un. So it starts with Trump threatening to destroy the country, namely kill 25 million innocent civilians. And it ends up last week with Trump in New York wandering around the UN saying, I love him. Can he meet me and make a deal? Now, look at it from Kim Jong-un's perspective. He did 3 things. First, he consolidated power by killing off his rivals. Second, he decided he's about to enter a great poker game, so he decided he wanted to put chips on the table, so he built weapons and tested them until the point where he broke the mountain that they're in. And then he suddenly realized, well, I can also now get more leverage and put more chips on the table by de-escalating. So then he de-escalated and said, you know, I'll move toward denuclearization. Now, in law, toward is the catchphrase. You know, you're not there yet. And then Trump had already committed himself to negotiating at the highest level, which, among other things, requires patience and a command of detail, neither which he has. The net result of which is we're locked in this strange dance with the North Koreans in which Trump doesn't have the framework to do it. And the greatest irony of all is this. If you're going to get a deal with the North Koreans, it will look like the Iran nuclear deal, which Trump just walked away from. So the net result will be, I think Trump won't actually completely walk away from the Iran nuclear deal until he's got to deal with North Korea. Along the way, Trump got rid of all of his State Department people who knew about North Korea, and now they're begging them to come back.
And what about Russia, one of the other countries of concern?
Well, same thing.
For a number of reasons.
Well, I think, Helsinki was one of the great diplomatic disasters of modern times. Trump.
There are so many to choose from.
So I was in the Obama administration, I was in the Clinton administration, and when you have these head of state meetings, there's a small meeting and a large meeting. The large meeting involves a lot of people, and it's very visible. And then the small meeting are the issues the meetings where you really try to get something. And if you think that your leader is good in the one-on-one, you commit to do more in the small meeting. I mean, if your principal is LeBron James, you say, let's play one-on-one. Trump then says, I'm going to go one-on-one with Kim Jong-un and not let anybody in. We have no idea what happened there, and the same thing happens with Putin. We have no idea what happens there. What Trump didn't realize, though, is that our allies are going to be pushing us after Salisbury and the nerve gas incident. The Congress has now imposed unprecedented sanctions. So we're in a funny place, which is that Trump is himself soft on Russia, but we have the toughest sanctions regime against Russia that we've had in a long time.
And do you think he's been more effective in dealing with IS?
The Islamic State, well, Hillary Clinton, who was here yesterday, in fact, that's why I'm here. She just became a fellow of the Mansfield College and the Bonavero Human Rights Institute, which is a great new asset to Oxford. She had a bi-level plan for dealing with the Islamic State. One was, with regard to the hardest core elements, there was a hard power aspect. I mean, some of the people are essentially irrevocably committed to warfare. But the broader strategy was one of changing people's hearts and minds with cutting off money, internet manipulation, counteracting online ideology. And what Trump has done is he's adopted, principally through Secretary of Defense Mattis, he's adopted the hard power strategy, but none of the soft power strategy. And hard power alone doesn't work. At a certain point, the hard power gets people to the table, and then you need to negotiate with them. And that's not something that they're good at doing.
So what would the components of the soft power strategy look like?
Well, I think the complication now is the relationship between the Islamic State and the Syrian government. I personally believe more should have been done earlier to combat Assad. Notice the craziness that Trump will bomb Syria on behalf of Syrian children who have been gassed, but then he won't take them into the country as refugees. What sort of intellectual apparatus comes up with this kind of interpretation? There was a multilateral solution possible, I think, in 2011. Now, Assad is about ready to crush the opposing forces. Meanwhile, the Kurds are there. Nobody's sure exactly what to do with them. I don't think Trump wants to recognize them, but I don't know that he has that much option. They will probably end up partitioning the country in some way. You need a massive aid package. And just look at the Syrian refugee crisis has been the source of Brexit and so many other problems. And this goes to a broader point, which is that Trump is really the symptom. He's not the cause. Globalization unleashed a set of forces that made wages freeze, that made people think that the middle class was losing out, and then they blamed foreigners. And then they blame a philosophy of diversity, multiculturalism, and inclusion. And then this sparks nationalist movements across Europe and across the world. And they all do the same thing. They attack judges, they cow legislators, they call media fake news, they try to change the Constitution, and most fundamentally, they blame immigrants.
I mean, you say that he's a symptom, not a cause, but in terms of the power of symptoms and his role on the world stage, he's obviously got huge capacity to influence. And so in terms of what you were just saying there about criticizing judges and legislators, what would you say about John Bolton's recent remarks about the ICC and the threat of sanctions and criminal measures that have been said that they will impose on judges and prosecutors coming into the US? I mean, that's again another extreme example of moving away from anything remotely globalist.
It's true. The problem is that, again, a speech is not a law. There's absolutely no legal basis to punish or prevent.
No.
I mean, these guys have diplomatic passports. I mean, they can enter the United States. I don't know what he's talking about. There's no basis laid to block prosecutors and investigators from coming in. You know, John Bolton, he's not a person that many people like. And as a result of it, I think his time in the government is going to be limited. And he did have this particular agenda against the ICC. I saw it before, you know, and it's Bolton bluster. They attack the ICC, the next administration comes in and ignores it.
But it's consistent with what the Trump administration has done in relation to other multilateral bodies, the Human Rights Council, for example. So it's consistent with that overall retreat away from multilateralism.
There's a very funny story. There's a brief that's been filed at the U.S. Supreme Court in a intergovernmental organizations immunities case called JAM versus International Finance Corporation. And in the statement of interest of the amicus, they write, "We love international organizations. We love multilateral institutions. We're members of 200. It was an important part of our national interest to be connected to the international system." So clearly, this official statement to the U.S. Supreme Court just never got vetted at the White House. But that's the deep state's commitment, or what I would call the enlightened bureaucracy statement about why we need these international organizations. Okay,
so drawing the at least three strands together from what we've touched on, the counter-strategy, the inside and outside, the resigning without leaving, the countries of concern and the way that they're being addressed by the Trump administration. Drawing those three major strands together, what do we learn from the time that he spent in office so far?
He said, you'll get so tired of, we'll win so much you'll get tired of winning. In fact, he's losing so much, he should be getting tired of losing. So what's happened? 60 executive orders, virtually no outcome. 35 senior officials, all left and fired, including yesterday, Nikki Haley. You know, travel ban, he's lost any legitimacy on the immigration front, and the litigation continues. Climate change, he hasn't withdrawn. Torture, he's made the order. Trade wars, he said, were easy to win. He's losing those. Russia is getting the better of the United States. North Korea is getting the better of the United States. And then I think the net result of it is that this is across the board disaster, which is what everybody sees. And I think it's because he has his, diagnosis wrong. He thinks that the world is zero sum. It's not. He thinks our allies should shut up. In fact, they should stand up for our common values. He thinks that globalization hurts us. It's a zero-sum game, as opposed to the notion that we should manage globalization so that it works to lift all boats. And so the diagnosis is feeding the mob, but it's not going to lead to long-term success. Now, I know what everybody's asking is two things. Muhammad Ali was badly battered and came unglued. And, if Trump wins a second term, who knows how long these institutions will last. But the other piece is, when is the knockout? When does Ali come off the ropes? I would hope it begins starting November 6th. I think the Democrats will win the House. Trump at this point has 2 Supreme Court justices and a tax cut. I think the Republicans will say, we're not going to get much more out of Trump. He's hurting us in a lot of respects. Now Nikki Haley is available. Mitt Romney is back on the scene. Mike Pence is there doing apparently nothing. Then I think Mueller will move in. You know, Mueller has flipped Trump's campaign manager, his accountant, his personal lawyer. He will become surrounded by a web of, unindicted co-conspirator charges. And then they might decide it's better to have somebody primary Trump and replace him with someone who they think has a chance to win the 2020 election. Now, on the other side, and also lurking in the background are the 25th Amendment, which allows someone to be removed as unstable. You know, we've now seen twice Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, has reported he wanted to wear a wire so that he could invoke the 25th Amendment. And with the 25th Amendment, it takes only 9 people to remove the president that day as being unfit for office. And then it says that the anonymous official, Nikki Haley or whoever, said they thought about invoking the 25th Amendment. So I think that the pressures will come to bear. You know, Trump just has too much baggage, and he brings too little in terms of real pluses.
But you said he was a symptom, not the cause. So if we talk, going back to what you were talking about earlier, about the actual bigger issues at play, which you talk about in the book, can you explain the concepts that you use to describe what's really at stake, the two ideologies that seem to be fighting it out at the moment?
Yeah, so, you've read Immanuel Kant, Toward Perpetual Peace. What he described is, it's not world government. It's a law-governed international society where like-minded democracies committed to the rule of law band together around a certain set of values, including human rights and democracy. And that structure roughly explains the UN, the Bretton Woods system, and the other global institutions that have carried us since 1945. You know, the counter to that is George Orwell's 1983, which is authoritarian structures where there is no truth, where we change allies every day, where people live in a kind of surveillance state, and where all the news is fake. And what I think is trying to happen now, with more immediacy than any time in my lifetime, is an effort to shift to that second system. The problem is that so many of us are so deeply invested in the system that we have, and we're all participants. I mean, I should give a shout out to Shaheed's brilliant book on protecting children in armed conflict. This is not done by any government official, but what it is a collection of thoughts about law and a strategy for how we can identify a problem, bring it to the attention of existing organizations, and focus on this problem. And it's not calling on any particular government to do anything. But, we live in a world of empowered individuals, and we can network too. And, that kind of group got us the Landmines Convention. It got us the Paris Agreement. And we're able to network and coordinate through the internet in ways that were not possible before. And I think that that's part of the counter strategy. The technological link-up is working with the idea of protecting the process. But I think a big point is this. Everybody watches and they say, I can't follow it. Part of Trump's strategy is simply to overwhelm us, flood the zone with initiatives. And so the purpose of the book is to pull back, show you the big picture, say that a counter strategy is emerging, and then call people to action. People who are ill, they don't heal themselves. They need lots and lots of people supporting them, doctors, family. And, our body politic is ill, and we all need to work on it, which means, for example, that we could use schools of government, and we could use masters in public policy, and we could use global networks. So it all comes down to the Beatles, right? We can get by, but we need a little help from our friends.
And also the point that you just mentioned there, in fact, about where we're sitting now, is that you cannot separate law and policy in this particular area. They are so closely intertwined that you do need to see them as being part of a cohesive whole.
Yes, and so, there's a tendency among international lawyers to say that's a legal issue, it's not a policy issue. But what I learned in government is there are some things that are legally possible but politically impossible. There are some things that are legal but bad policy. We used to call those awful but lawful. And then there are some things which you'd love to have, but you can't do it as a matter of politics. The play Hamilton has a famous song, you don't have the votes, you don't have the votes. If you don't have the votes, it might be the best thing in the world. So what different advocates try to do is those things they can embed in policy, they do. Those things they can embed in law, they do. Those things that are political possible, they do. The civil rights movement in the United States is a very good illustration of how litigation, legislation, and movement on the streets all led to a certain set of outcomes. I think we're seeing it again with the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter.
And so I suppose the ultimate message of the book is one of optimism.
It's not self-correcting optimism. It's a call to action. We own this process. Donald Trump doesn't own this process. We own this process. The great comedian Mel Brooks tells this joke about the 2,000-year-old man. And they asked the 2,000-year-old man, before there was a God, was there someone else? And he said, yeah, there was this guy named Phil. And they said, what did we say? We said, oh, Phil, you're all powerful. Don't kick us and don't beat us and don't hurt us. And then one day lightning came out of the sky and struck Phil dead. And we said, there's something bigger than Phil. There's something bigger than Donald Trump. And that's this transnational process that we're all a part of.
Great. Well, I think, Harold, that's brought us to the end of our time. Thank you so much for such a lucid explanation of the key concepts and ideas in the book. And I should also just say, before I hand back to Dapo, that quite fittingly, we are in the School of Government, because this is not a book that's only for international lawyers by any means. It's written for a far broader audience, and it's one of the rare books, and I haven't said this to Harold so far, that you can actually read in one sitting because it's so accessible. And I think that's one of the great virtues of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure.
So Professor Koh has kindly agreed to take questions. We are due to close at 2:05 or thereabouts, so we have 10 minutes plus for Q&A. Just to inform you that the event is being live streamed. So if you don't want anyone to know that you are here at this point in time, you may not want to ask a question. There are people with microphones around the room, so if you just put up your hand, somebody will give you a microphone, and then, yes, so the gentleman over there, right at the back there.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and the questions were very good. So I want to pick a little bit on what you said about Republicans, because while I think, and I thank you for the energizing view on the defense of the liberal world order, I would have to ask, what do you think on the increasing tendency of Republicans to reject that order? There was a bipartisan consensus on the conveniency of free trade agreements, and now Republicans seem to reject that idea. While you said that the United States liked international multilateralism, there seems to be increased forces within the Republican Party that reject that, and they are electorally successful, whereas those that do not share those views are losing elections, are losing primaries. So I would like to hear more on what are your thoughts on that.
Maybe we should collect a couple of questions and then let Harold respond. So I saw a hand, lady at the back over there.
Professor Koh, thank you very much for a really brilliant book. And I sort of flipped through sort of the references, my areas in Chinese law, and I'm very curious about your view on, given the context of the trade wars that's been happening, and and China's growing role in the international legal and political order, sort of whether the Trump administration losing this sort of, I guess, influence on the international stage is going to see the emergence of China sort of willingly or not taking the reins of a new global order.
So on the latter, China is eagerly filling the void. And I think, again, the notion of a trade deficit in an age in which products are assembled in many different countries. Why do you call something a British product when in fact it was assembled with pieces from many different parts of the world? It was the case that European products could be assembled anywhere in Europe. So the idea of erecting these trade barriers, again, in the name of sovereignty, is a huge error in a globalized economy. And the same message is the answer to your question. The Republicans are trading on a notion of sovereignty that disappeared at the end of the 20th century. I'll give you a good example. The Republicans don't want to join the Law of the Sea Treaty, even though most of the world has joined a long time ago. In fact, the net result is that the United States has been kept out of a treaty where the Russians and the Chinese are in. The Republicans hate more. And they're essentially ceding to them, to the Russians, the Arctic, and to the Chinese, the South China Sea, in the name of protecting our sovereignty. Nothing could be more ludicrous. What's happening now, though, with the with the Republicans, is that they have become a party with no values. They previously were committed in theory to certain values, and as you now see, none of those values will they stick to. They're not free trade, they're not social morality. Their primary commitment is to guns and getting their folks onto the Supreme Court. And we also have the final oddity, which is really for the first time in a long time, we have a coalition government. There's Trump and there are the Republicans. And neither of them has a majority, but they've made this marriage of convenience. The goal was to repeal health care. They haven't done that. Then it was to get a tax cut for the wealthy. They did get that, but it's not selling. And now the last piece of what they've banded around is getting their justices on the Supreme Court. But it's very hard. Evangelicals and religious people, how can they support Trump? He's a person who's antithetical to their value. So I think what we're seeing is the disintegration of the idea of the Republican Party as a party that has any sort of philosophy about domestic or international matters. The challenge, though, is for the Democrats and the left to come up with a candidate and a philosophy, a messenger and a message, which can reunite the country around a more traditional discussion, the values of diversity and inclusion, the value of immigration. To just remind people that, Barack Obama, is a first-generation American. Bill Clinton was an orphan. He never knew his father. There are extraordinary opportunities. Look at me. There are extraordinary opportunities in the United States of America. It's probably the society in the world that has the greatest opportunity for upward movement in one generation. And it's a country where, by and large, very diverse groups manage to coexist. And I think people are very uncomfortable with the notion that you're supposed to demonize your neighbors. Even in churches and other places, people just find themselves very resistant to the notion of blaming somebody else for all your problems.
Okay, a couple more questions. I'm going to take a couple of questions.
Thank you, Professor Koh, for being with us today. Really like the discussion and the ideas you brought up. So my question is around the women empowerment movement. I think one big idea of this era is the Me Too movement that has been on that move 1 year till this year. And I think the point I want to make is we've been witnessing some achievements, such as we've seen more women in Nobel laureates this year. There has been news that California made it a requirement that every public corporation needs to have a female in the board of directors. So I think a lot of problems are being criticized by people for causing reverse discrimination on these issues, because once you implement these policies, people tend to think that the female community is structurally weak and needs help from government, from society to help them, extend their powers and achieve the gender equality. So I think I wanted to ask, what's your take on this, and what do you think we should do, the entire, feminist movement community should do to avoid those such consequences and achieve better success in the future?
Very simple thing, which is more women getting elected. And when women are in the positions of governmental authority, their concerns are heard in a way that they're not heard. And so on the Supreme Court or in the legislature or wherever. And then it's also deeply connected with issues like family, reproductive rights. When I was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, I learned that in Tunisia, when the average woman gave birth to 7 children in a lifetime, there was nobody in the parliament. When through family planning that had dropped to 2 children per per woman, they went to a 50-50 parliament. So it seems to me that this is going to be a wave election. I mean, I think the net result of the Supreme Court fight will be when, my daughter and people of her generation watch a bunch of 80-year-old white guys ram through Brett Kavanaugh. They say, I don't want those guys there anymore. And, they're mobilizing and they're voting and they're going out on the street to vote. So I think we'll see what happens on November 6th.
So let's take 2 final questions. 2 over here. You can go first.
Thank you, Professor, for your insight on the book. I want to ask about how do you see the Trump administration strategy regarding the Afghanistan? I mean, beside the different efforts, the peace is not restored perfectly. Still, there are certain areas where fighting is going on. And rather than blaming the other countries like Pakistan to do more, what would be its strategy to have a safe exit or leave this area like the previous government back in 80s did it? They left the country on its own fate and left this area. Thank you.
And the final question.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. As a civil servant who previously worked for the Obama administration, I suppose I'm slightly less sanguine about the prospects for change from within the professional bureaucracy. And as you know, in the last few months of the Obama administration, there was a large effort to try to institutionalize some of the reforms and policies that they had made, particularly surrounding restrictions on drone strikes, as well as issues surrounding the Iran nuclear deal. And so my question is this: how can we have confidence that those efforts to institutionalize such policies really succeeded and that the Trump administration is not, in fact, leading to a deterioration of the norms surrounding international law and U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the wake of the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA and the sanctions that will be reimposed on November 4th, and some of the loosening of restrictions that we've seen surrounding drone strikes, particularly the near certainty standard?
Well, so obviously I worked on the drone strike standard. A lot of this goes to the unit commanders, and there are a number of the unit commanders who absolutely refuse to do anything other than follow the Obama playbook. The most visible deviation has been on Yemen, and so obviously, and a lot of this is classified, so a key of this will be transparency. On the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, this is an exercise of Congress's sanctions power. And most of the deal already occurred, you know, when they gave sanctions relief. And as you may have seen, Trump's decision to withdraw led to a suit by Iran against the United States at the International Court of Justice, and they lost a provisional measures ruling. So what I'm saying there is, just as in everything else, transnational legal process is pushing back. You know, Shaheed and her colleagues here did all kinds of things before the European Court of Human Rights on extraterritoriality of European human rights law into war zones. So I think that, you know, am I sanguine? No. You know, again, this goes to the point. These things don't take care of themselves. It's not a self-correcting thing. You have to fight for it. And, you know, Martin Luther King says the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. You have to make it bend. And that's what people need to do. On Afghanistan, you know, the decision to go into Iraq and to pour the resources into Iraq instead of into Afghanistan was a grotesque, tragic failure. And they still have not left Iraq, and Iraq itself is now, they've destabilized that country as well. It's also clear that you cannot resolve the situation in Afghanistan without doing two things: giving them very substantial economic aid, and secondly, negotiating with the Taliban under certain conditions. And that had begun in the Obama administration under Richard Holbrooke, my former colleague. And then it went cold. Now they're negotiating again. But what Holbrooke said to me once is that the measure of progress in Afghanistan is the number of women who are being educated, the number of people who have cell phones, the number of people who are getting their standard of living raised. And that has to be the focus, and it was the focus of a collective effort. Under Trump, there is no leader, and the United States is limping behind. This is the general story. If the United States doesn't lead, other people with similar values have to step up.
Before we wrap up, let me just make two announcements. So first of all, let me inform you of an event that's taking place next week, also being hosted by the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. It's next Friday evening at 5 o'clock in this room, or the next one, I'm not sure. If they'll let me back in as I destroy things. So it is an event on protecting civilians in armed conflict and on the current challenges relating to that. Let me also remind you that there are copies of Harold's book at the back, and that Harold has agreed to stay behind to sign copies of the book. And if you're not able to pick up a copy of the book, pick up a leaflet, and you can get the book online. And it just leaves me to thank both Harold and Shaheed for coming and for that stimulating discussion. Thank you for returning to Oxford, and we hope that we will see both of you back here again soon. Thank you.